Welcome to the second presentation for this year's BAPT Symposium on Psychological Type. It's a great honour to welcome here the Head of Thought Leadership for the Myers-Briggs company, based here in the UK, John Hackston. So he's going to share his thoughts about alternative facts, the demonization of type. Thank you, John.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Thank you also to Steve for his great talk before. And Steve, if you're listening, I'm glad you got the memo about wearing a checky shirt this evening. Sadly, Richard clearly didn't. So welcome, everybody. And as you can see, and as Richard said, this talk is called Alternative Facts, the Demonization of Type. And my name is John Hackston, and I'm the Head of Thought Leadership for the Myers-Briggs company. Although what you hear in the next hour isn't necessarily always going to be the Myers-Briggs company line on type, because I'm really keen to get your views. So as Richard says, there's going to be a couple of polls and a couple of breakout groups as we go through. We play those a little bit by ear to see how the time goes. We may shorten some. We'll just see how we go today. So why have I called this talk Alternative Facts, the Demonization of Type? Well, I don't think that I'm a bad person. I don't think many people are, really. Mostly, I think most people, most of the time, try to do the right thing by their lights. And when it comes to using type, I think type is useful. Type helps people. I think generally, at least when it comes to using type, if not in all parts of my life, I try to be on the side of the angels. But not everybody would agree. Some may see people who use type not as angels, but perhaps as demons. One of the central themes of this whole set of talks, and this one in particular, is that academic psychologists, mainstream psychology, don't see type in the same way as type practitioners do, or as we've heard from Steve's talk, as young people who specialize in young do. And sometimes it feels as if we're being demonized for using type or even defending use of type. Perhaps we're not quite being burned at the stake as heretics. It's not quite a witch hunt, but maybe sometimes it doesn't feel quite so far off. So I'm going to ask you, what does it feel like when you hear an academic criticizing the MBTI assessment or the type approach? And this is where we find out, because I can't tell, how many of you are still listening. So Richard, if you'd like to launch that first poll, please. So what you should see on your screen at the moment is a poll which says, what does it feel like when you hear an academic criticizing the type approach? And you can choose it depends, some criticisms are valid, I just ignore it unless I'm forced to pay attention, I just think they don't know what they're talking about, I get upset, I feel personally hurt or insulted by what they say, or I get annoyed, I want to fight back. So if you'd like to choose your answer.
I'd like to say, John, I actually made this a multiple choice. So I don't know if that was the right intention, but
that was the multiple choice. That was, yeah, people could choose one option.
Oh no, I thought let them choose multiple. So
oh, okay, people could choose. Oh, let's people choose more than one. We'll see what we come up with. Okay, so I'm not sure that I can, because I'm not a co-host, I can see how that poll is going, Richard. How many people are filling it in?
So we've got 25 of 30, 83% have voted.
83%, okay.
A few more seconds, last chance to vote.
Tick, 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 boom!
Okay.
Right, if you'd like to stop the poll, Richard. I apologize to people's eardrums. Okay, so nearly 2/3 said it depends, criticism is valid. Nearly just over a quarter, I just think they don't know what they're talking about. 8% say I get upset, I feel personally hurt or insulted by what they say, and 15% say I get annoyed, I want to fight back. I'm not going to work out by the percentages of other people exactly how many people are each, but perhaps you feel, or whether you feel, that actually some criticisms are valid. But others would react in different ways. And some of you had an emotional reaction. Do hold on to that, because we're going to come back to that later. Some of you might want to fight our corner, shout, no, that's wrong. And it may be from the title of this presentation, that's what you're expecting from this session. So what we could do in the next hour is to go through point by point all the ways that type and the MBTI be criticized and go through and refute them one by one. And it's going to be a little bit of that because from our point of view, maybe sometimes it's the academics who are demons and we're the edges and we should put them straight. But this set of talks and this talk isn't about that. This set of talks is about bridging that gap with academia. So point scoring and name calling probably isn't going to help with that. We need to find a way to talk together, to find a place where people can see that both the type and the trait approach, both have value, both have validity. Because if you look at the bigger picture, we're actually all in this together. Because this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not the case that we win where academic trait psychologists lose or vice versa. Some of you may have seen the Persona film that aired in the States on HBO Max. Others may have heard of it. It was largely, I'll be very polite and say it was rubbish. But one interesting point was how people who I guess might be typically competitors of the MBTI assessment reacted to it. Some, including some of the type community, essentially said, oh yes, the MBTI, that's awful. You should buy our thing and said, it's great. Others, and I obviously think this is a more preferable stance, said, I don't agree with anything about the MBTI. Sometimes I don't agree with a lot about the MBTI, but this program has misrepresented it and personality assessment generally, and we should call that out. So we may have more in common with mainstream psychology and academic psychologists than we realize. And that perhaps they always realize. Because as far as the big wide world out there is concerned, to some extent, we're really talking about very much the same thing. So let's talk to our colleagues and our colleagues in academia, not shouting at each other like on this slide, but trying to get that conversation going. But to do this effectively, I think there's a couple of things that we need to do first. First, we need to understand what the criticisms of type actually are, so we can properly engage with them. And second, we may need to re-examine some of our own ideas, some of our own preconceptions, some of our values even, and maybe let go of some of the things that Steve was talking about earlier. But let's start with the criticisms of the MBTI. Here's a couple of questions for you. I'd like you to take just a couple of minutes to think about how you personally might answer them. And then we're going to assign you to breakout groups to discuss your answers. So what criticisms of a type approach or the MBTI have you heard? And of those, which did you have the greatest emotional reaction to, which stung you the most? And what have you found the most difficult to answer? So think for your initial response, and you might want to also, when you've done that, to think back about how that might relate to your particular type. So Richard, we have, I think, 30 people, just over 30 people on the call at the moment?
Yeah, 31, yeah.
31, so if we split it to 5 breakout groups, that works, I think, for relatively sized groups.
That's 6 participants per room.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So if you like to just assign people randomly to those groups, you should see a request appear on your screen very soon, asking you to invite you to a room. I'll stay out of your rooms while you're doing it and let you have your discussions, and we bring you back together in, let's have a look. Let's be exact about this, 7 minutes time. Okay, Richard, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to put these up. So you'll have to select the enter the room option when that comes along. And I'm going to just, yeah, if I say close after 7 minutes, I'll just set that setting.
That should do.
And there'll be a 60-minute countdown. So actually it'll be, so we want 6 minutes plus the 60 seconds count.
Yeah, that'll be good.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay, open all rooms. Here we go.
Great, thank you.
Let's see an invite on your screen if you don't.
So just, yeah, so just click join and you should be whisked away as if by magic. And I'll just myself stay out of those rooms just for now.
I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, we're recording again now. As so we've just been in the breakout rooms. I'd just like you to share in the chat any kind of outcome that you've had from that.
So any common criticisms, any criticisms you've heard? It might be about the time approach as a whole, it might be specific about the MBTI, and any reflections on how it makes you feel. And while I've given you a chance to do that, and hopefully we get lots of lovely responses in just a moment, I'm just going to start by going through some of the things that I've come across, some of the criticisms that I've come across in respect of the MBTI and of type more generally. Okay, I don't want to be put in the box. Yeah, we'll certainly talk about that. I think when we look at those sort of criticisms, I've tried to actually separate them into, or categorize them or put them in types. And actually I've taken 3 categories, not 2 categories. And the categories I've looked at are criticisms which you might see as dismissive or offensive criticisms, the things that might really get you going and annoyed. So this particular person in this picture is about to take a hammer to her computer screen. Or it might make you want to type a response really quickly. Things that really get your goat. Yeah. What have we got coming for? It's meaningless. Myers-Briggs wasn't a psychologist. It's like astrology for personality types. And lazy thinking generally. Steve Myers might be a little bit one-sided. I'll won't do that in detail, Megan. It's quite long, but please do read it. It's very interesting. Anna Jane Peake was confusing. It's not scientific. What makes me really mad is when people say it's not valid. I'm interested in the assumption behind the questions we've all asked about sure being defensive about criticisms. Interesting, Julie. That probably reflects some of my own views, but we'll come on to that. So dismissive or offensive criticisms might be one sort. Then we have criticisms which may seem to have a little bit more science behind them, but are specifically about the MBTI. And then we have criticisms which might be rather more generally about type. So what I'd like to do is go through those each in turn, starting off with those more dismissive or offensive criticisms. So here's the first one, which is one that you've actually mentioned in the chat already. Myers-Briggs didn't know what they were doing. They weren't psychologists. They didn't have those skills. You tended to used to hear a little while ago, they were, and I put this in quotes, only 2 housewives. And I think there's still a little bit of a whiff of sexism and misogyny around some aspects of that criticism. I think there's a number of answers to that. They did both have degrees at a time where that was really very unusual for women, although not in psychology. They weren't psychometricians, but very few other people were at the time. And of course, the versions of the MBTI being used today have been developed and fine-tuned by PhD psychologists and psychometricians down the years. But more importantly, I think, you don't have to have lots of qualifications to produce something wonderful, especially when, like personality questionnaires back in the 1940s and 50s, it's very much a new field. To take an example, the first people who successfully developed and flew a powered airplane were 2 brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright. They were self-taught engineers who essentially ran a bicycle repair shop, but they got there ahead of more well-funded teams from universities. But although those 2 individual people didn't have qualifications in aerodynamics, not many people today say, I'm not going on an airplane, I'm not going to take a flight, because the people who developed, who had invented airplanes in the first place, didn't have the proper qualifications. Sometimes those criticisms are a bit more personal. Isabel Myers was a racist. Jung was a Nazi. Well, we've talked a little bit about that second criticism there in Steve's presentation. There's a little bit of truth to it, perhaps, although generally speaking, the way it's phrased is very much overblown. The idea that Isabel was a racist stems from the fact that she wrote a novel which is seen as racist. If you've actually read it, and I've had it, it's not my favorite novel, it's arguably not racist, but yes, some characters in the book definitely are. But on that basis, well, we should be quite careful about what books we call racist. Perhaps we should ban books like To Kill a Mockingbird, which include racist characters, or films like 12 Years a Slave. And I think one of the key things there is, whatever the character of the people who develop something, it doesn't obviate the usefulness of the thing they developed. Not that I agree with those two criticisms. For example, Isaac Newton, by all accounts, was an absolutely terrible, terrible person. But we don't disbelieve in gravity. Now, sometimes the criticism might feel a little bit patronizing. If only you were as clever as me, you'd realize this whole type thing is rubbish. And it might segue into, if you're not a fool, if you actually take this stuff seriously, clearly you're a rogue, you're a charlatan, you're only in this for the money. With the subtext that we're all making millions of dollars from it. So of course we all are. And for people like me who work for the Myers-Briggs company, that means that sometimes critics just refuse to listen. Of course you say that. It's in your commercial interest to say that. And actually, this is a really good argument for getting this series of talks going, for getting academics engaged with the MBTI and with type approaches. Because these people have no commercial interest, or mostly no commercial interest, and tend to be taken, for good or ill, more seriously by the media than others. And for example, in a Persona documentary, you might get criticisms like this. People will say that the MBTI was developed and is scored on the basis of white middle-class Americans. Maybe this was true to an extent in the 1940s, even in the 1960s, but it's demonstrably false now. It's claimed that it only works in Western society, again, demonstrably false. But it causes discrimination, where all the evidence shows that it brings people together, and so on. When you examine these criticisms in detail, and they all often loop in those criticisms about racism that we saw earlier, they actually often boil down to the idea that any form of categorizing or assessing people, or even having them assess themselves, is at some level wrong. So this is one place where we might have common cause with mainstream psychologists and academic trait psychologists. Now, these are often rather unthinking criticisms. Sometimes very easy to answer and argue. Sometimes they've been picked up by almost professional contrarians who just want an argument. But some criticisms at least appear to have a bit more oomph, a bit more science behind them. Some are about the whole idea of type, others are more specifically about the MBTI assessment, about the questionnaire. And we're going to look at these first. Just looking at the chart, I can see there's a few of these have already appeared in what you said. You might hear people say the MBTI isn't reliable. Now, what might they actually mean by that? Well, psychologists might mean one of three things. They could be talking about what's called alternate form or parallel form reliability. If, for example, you had two different versions of the exam, so you can give one version of people who sit the exam on a Tuesday, and the other version who sit the exam on a Wednesday, so there's no comparing notes between the two groups, you want to make sure that both versions measure the same thing. There's a correlation between scores on both versions. That's what's called alternate form reliability. Do the two alternate forms measure the same thing? But as you can see, that's really not relevant at all for the MBTI. There's also internal consistency reliability. Do all the questions in the test, or do all the questions in the scale of a questionnaire measure the same thing? And the MBTI actually has excellent internal consistency reliability, freely available online for anyone to look up. Many other type questionnaires also have good internal consistency reliability, though some of the free ones perhaps that information is lacking. But when someone says the MBTI isn't reliable, and they actually know what they're talking about, they're probably talking about what's called test-retest reliability. Do people tend to get the same results if they take the questionnaire and then take it again a fortnight or a month or 6 months later? And if you look at the numbers, you find that the MBTI does as well as most personality questionnaires, better than some. We heard in Steve's presentation from Julie about there are exceptions to this, but generally people tend to answer in the same way on different occasions. And you'll find the statistical details of this on the MBTI Facts website page, that I'll give you a link to in a moment. Now, it's certainly true that not everyone is in agreement on all 4 letters, second time around, but most people you will find on agreement on most of them. You also hear the MBTI isn't valid. Now, sometimes people are just saying this and they don't really know what that means. It is useful to ask what they mean by it. When critics do know what they're talking about, mostly they're saying that it lacks predictability. It doesn't predict outcomes. It doesn't predict things happening in the real world or relate to things happening in the real world. By which they typically actually mean that it doesn't predict job performance. Now, listen carefully, because I'm going to let you into a secret. It's not meant to. It's a little bit like, and many of you will have heard this analogy before, if I take a screwdriver and I hold the screwdriver up, and I meant to bring this as a prop to show you and I forgot, so I apologize. But I had an imaginary screwdriver here. And I pick this screwdriver up and I say, this is a terrible, awful, ridiculously bad screwdriver. I've been trying to bang a nail into the wall with this screwdriver and it's of no use whatsoever. Clearly, I'm using a wrong tool. I should be using a hammer. So criticizing the MBTI or any type approach for not predicting job performance is just missing the point entirely. There is some good evidence that the MBTI does predict relevant outcomes. So things which are about individual people's development. For example, student grades improved after their teachers had been giving MBTI training. Students and others have been shown to be more certain about their career choice after MBTI feedback. Ratings of various things like teamwork, communication, problem solving, ratings by managers, ratings by people themselves have improved after MBTI interventions across various studies. Even an example that architects were better at designing residential environments that met people's needs after they studied type. So there's a lot of evidence that the MBTI and the use of type more generally predicts relevant developmental outcomes, just not job performance. And of course, it's good to have more of these studies. And I think this is something that Keith McCormick is going to be talking about tomorrow, but still there's already some evidence there. There's also a rather more nuanced argument, which says, well, you could use the MBTI, but why not use a Big 5 assessment instead? It is all that the MBTI can and more. In the jargon of psychometrics, they're saying that the 5-factor model shows incremental validity over the Big 5. But if you look at the research actually says it depends. You get different results from different research studies depending on what outcome has been addressed. In some studies, the Big 5 does better. It has incremental validity over the MBTI. In other studies, the MBTI does better. It has incremental validity over Big 5. It depends what you're looking at, which frankly shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And finally, sometimes the critics who measure validity are talking about construct validity. This tends to be more academics and less the things you'll see on websites or in lay articles. Construct validity is, does the questionnaire actually measure what it says it does? Does it do what it says on the tin? And the most common criticism here is that the MBTI does not measure neuroticism or anxiety, which is an odd criticism to make because the MBTI never set out to do this. It never said it did that. We're back perhaps in hammer and screwdriver territory here. Slightly more sophisticated criticisms look at the factor structure of the MBTI and suggest that the questionnaire actually only measures 3 factors or 2 factors rather than the 4 preference pairs. But first of all, this ignores the utility of those 4 pairs in the type approach. And secondly, as well as the studies that criticize the factor structure, there's quite a few studies that say the factor structure works well, and those 4 preference pairs hold together rather well. Now, some of these criticisms, maybe most of these, are what you might call zombie criticisms. However hard you try, they just won't die. You think you've beaten them down and suddenly the hand reaches back out from the grave again. But when you see these, more often perhaps in popular media on websites for non-academic publications, but in some academic publications as well, they nearly always refer back to an article by this guy, David J. Pittenger. Usually his 2005 article, which is essentially a rehash of 2 articles he wrote nearly 30 years ago in 1993. Now, there's lots of issues about this, not least that even when this was written, it was out of date. Yet it does keep coming back like a revenant to haunt us. So if you see anything influenced by that, I would really strongly recommend watching this YouTube video by a different academic, Aqualis Gordon. He speaks very eloquently in defense of type of the MBTI, including starting at, I think, about 6 minutes 40 into his presentation, a step-by-step refutation of a Pittenger article. Now, by all means, take a screenshot of this. I think, however, I know that this session is being recorded, so you can come back and pause the screen if you haven't got time to make a note of it now. But I really suggest that it's a nice idea to have a look at that video. Now, in this presentation, I haven't stopped to go into the details behind the statistics, all of those numbers, partly for time reasons, partly because, frankly, if you're watching this in the United Kingdom, it's probably a bit late in the day to take in lots of numbers. So instead, let me direct you to this webpage. It includes written answers to most of those criticisms we've talked about so far. And those of you with really good eyesight might be able to see on your screen that at number 16, we have the MBTI, is the MBTI assessment reliable? And at 17, is the MBTI assessment valid? So you can see some answers in a bit more detail there. But of course, there's one aspect of the MBTI assessment that we haven't touched on. There's very much an elephant in this room. Nearly all of these criticisms about the MBTI's properties, if you like, as a test, as something which is standing on its own and used on its own. But the MBTI isn't a test. It's a whole process designed to help people decide for themselves what type fits them best, and then how to make use of that information. It's called the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the clues in the name, not the Myers-Briggs type test for that reason. The questionnaire results are only part of a process that includes, what in my view, has to include interactive feedback. And perhaps for a tool like the MBTI assessment, the questions you can see on your screen now are more important questions than the conventional concerns about validity. Questions about the whole process, not just questions about the questionnaire. Questions like, did the person experience the whole process as personally valuable? Were the outcomes that was intended by that developmental intervention, were they achieved? Can they still recall key learnings and make use of that information months later? Has it had an ongoing impact at work or whatever context you're using type 4? In a journal article a couple of years ago, Penny Moll and I described this approach as experiential validity. What is the validity of that whole experience? Something which tends to be neglected by mainstream psychology, although there is now a little bit of interest in it. So does that learning, does that knowledge stick to the surface of your brain so you can apply it to your life on an ongoing basis? So far, we've looked at criticisms that apply to the MBTI, but some criticisms are much more about the whole idea of type. Just looking at some of your questions, I think most of the things you said are a little bit more about the instrument, but I think it's really interesting and useful to look at type as well. For example, some people will say that type is like a horoscope, or the descriptions from the MBTI, other tools, they say they're really positive, they apply to anyone. You could pick up any of these descriptions and anybody would agree to it. It's got a Barnum effect. Well, there's some good experimental evidence, if people are over to look, to actually refute that. There have been studies when, for example, people are given descriptions of their own type as measured by reported type of questionnaire before feedback, or other types, and the people given their own type description are much more likely to agree with that description than the people given other type descriptions. And there's several studies of that nature. And type certainly doesn't have to, in my opinion, put people in a box. For me, it's more of a springboard for people to find out about themselves and explore other rooms in a type house. But some criticisms perhaps might need a little bit more thought. And this may go a little bit into some of the territory that Steve was talking about before. Is, for example, type theory at some level an historical artifact? I've heard it suggested, for example, and I'm not necessarily saying this is the case, but it's something I've heard put forward, that the idea of the flow of energy and the balancing of functions owes something to the idea that hydraulics was a fashionable science at the time that psychodynamics was being thought through. Is personality really type-like in nature or more like a continuous trait, something that Steve picked on earlier? Is our type innate or inborn or genetic, and does it ever change? And what about the situationist approach that suggests that actually there's no such thing as personality, it's only about the situation you're in? Perhaps there isn't even such a thing as self, or even not such a thing as consciousness. Now, a little while ago, I came across a paper with the interesting title of The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and Mainstream Psychology, Analysis and Evaluation of an Unresolved Hostility. And in talking about the lack of common ground between the type community and trait psychologists, this is what the author says. A harmonization will be achieved if each side of the argument could relinquish one of its cherished theoretical underpinnings. Specifically, the psychological type community should abandon its insistence that every individual is constitutionally either, for example, an extrovert or an introvert, and advocates of the trait approach should abandon the morally evaluative stance that, for example, extroversion is a desirable quality which introverts sadly lack in adequate measure. Now, you might agree with some of that, you might not. Perhaps it doesn't fit, for example, with the company line of a Myers-Briggs company. But let me ask you a question. What aspects of type theory or MBTI theory, and I'm aware they're not the same thing, but what aspects of those are sacrosanct? What are the stakes in the ground for you? What do you think we cannot give up? And conversely, what's less important? What could be up for discussion if we're going to have that conversation and engagement with mainstream psychology, as opposed to the values that can't be touched? In a moment, we're going to put you into breakout groups. Then we'll ask each group to report back on their views. And this time, what I'm going to ask you to do in each group is appoint a spokesperson who will actually speak out some of what the things that you've talked about during your conversation. Here's some ideas of things you might want to discuss, but these are just ideas. Feel free to include anything you want. And what I'd really like each group to come back with is one thing they think is sacrosanct and one thing they think could be up for discussion. Things we may want to think about: are they sacrosanct or not? Is type innate? Is it inborn? Is it the fact that your type doesn't change? This whole idea of personality is type-based or not a continuum or two ends or one thing or the other? Are type dynamics real? Is there anything to this idea of mental functions? Or is it just an artifact of the way we put type questionnaires and our ideas together? Do all types really have equal value? Should we think about using type in selection? I say not, but let's put it in there. And should we just use reported type, results of the questionnaire, and not worry too much about feedback? So what I'm going to ask Richard to do now is to split you into a number of breakout groups again. I'm going to give you, let's have a look at the time. I'm going to give you 8 minutes for this discussion. And after that, we'll come back and with one person from each group, could be the spokesperson, talking through your answers. Richard, are you okay to put people into groups now?
Yes, give me a second. I'm
Certainly.
recording now.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Richard. So I'm going to apologize now because I'm going to appear not to be looking at you, but that's because I've got all your lovely faces on a different screen over there. So who'd like to be a spokesperson for one of the groups and say a little bit about what one, or if you really have to, two aspects of MBTI or type theory are sacrosanct, and what one thing could be up for discussion? Who'd like to go first? Let's have a volunteer. Karen Kiefer, you got there just ahead of Carol Shoemate. So Karen, over to you. You need to unmute. I think you're on mute at the moment. You'll need to unmute yourself. Should be a little button towards the bottom of your screen. There you go.
Got it. Thank you. I just overlooked that. Okay, so we had, I think, three things. First of all, sacrosanct proved to be a difficult word for some of the members to work with. So it was rather strongly put.
That was the intention, but interesting it had that reaction.
Three things that we think are really important to hold on to. That the individual is the final authority on their own type.
Okay.
That opposites actually do exist. There is a reality there. And that we all use all four functions in every attitude all the time.
Okay.
So type is not the only, our type, our four-letter type is not the only thing we can do.
Excellent. And it'd be interesting, I think, to look back on this recording to see what the different groups they come up with as well. And that might be interesting for BAPT in the future. What about the things which might be up for discussion?
That maybe we ought to stop trying to make type so popular.
Okay. Interesting.
And,
there goes my Christmas bonus.
Yeah. And, and that the research agenda, there really needs to be one around type.
Okay. And what in particular do you feel is lacking in the research agenda?
Well, we would have to ask the person who brought that up. Roger, would you like to answer that? It was Roger Pierman who said that.
I won't even begin.
Okay.
We have a formidable number of questions that need both qualitative and quantitative research to enable us to look at the application of type in all the meaningful, productive ways we can identify.
I know there's a presentation tomorrow which looked at one aspect of research, so that might be interesting. Great, thank you very much. Carol Shoemate, you put your hand up just after Karen. What were your points?
A couple are very similar. We wanted to keep the 8 functions. I mean, we felt like that was pretty much sacrosanct. The idea of neutrality, that all types are equal.
Okay.
That type is a model of health. I guess type dynamics. And the things that we were willing to sacrifice, hardly anybody came up with anything, but a couple of us were willing to pull teeth and say if we had to sacrifice it. I said I might be willing to sacrifice using reported type in isolation, although I hate it, but I do think it might be necessary in terms of doing large experimental studies of, randomized, anonymized databases. I mean, I don't know how else you can do it.
I think there's probably a difference between using type in research, which has a place, I think, and using type in the actual real use of the instrument.
Right, it's very different when you're practicing it. And the other thing that some are willing to give up is the idea that type doesn't change, because of course the whole purpose of Jung's theory is to help us develop and grow.
Okay. Great, thank you. Let's have a spokesperson for one of the other groups now. Who'd like to go? Nate, over to you.
All right, excuse me for my nervous little jitters, but basically a lot of what we talked about in the breakout room was that a lot of things are could be up for discussion. I brought up the notion of the concept that your type does not change as well, and I was thinking about how does folks who surround like the folks who are maybe surrounding yourself could affect how your type manifests. Because as a person who leans to ENFP preferences, I don't have intuitive friends. I have a lot of sensor associates, and aside from that too, like cultural backgrounds kind of come in as well. And I know that sure you get typed when you're younger, or how it is with high school nowadays, but like over the years, is that like there's a lot of questions that could come up with that. Not that I disagree with my typing for myself either way. And another one was not taking some of the works from the previous schools, like for example Jung's work and Isabel's work, as gospel. A big part of I believe Steve and I were talking a little bit when talking about, because there are fundamentalists in different schools of type who believe in certain things, and I think that it's that while I highly respect and there is a reverence for the work of Jung and for Isabel Myers and all that stuff, I feel like there's still room for addition, like to add more, because as modern technology increases and I guess the scale of our data when it comes to researching for people can also widen itself, as well as the next generation of people who are interested in type, there is going to be more discoveries, and that might be more than what we got for Jung at the beginning.
Anything that was sacrosanct for your group?
Not necessarily.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so that's 3 groups. I think there's another group. Is another person? Would it be a spokesperson, or have I miscounted?
Did Doris have her hand up?
Yes,
Oh,
hi,
Doris,
thanks,
beg your
Richard.
pardon.
No worries, hi, John. Actually, that works nicely piggybacking off of Nate. I think one of the ideas or sacrosanct things that we were talking about in our group, which by the way, 2 theorists, 2 catalysts, was isn't there room for expansion? Is it really just that it has to be the opposites, or as Stephen mentioned in his previous presentation about looking at going into 3s and looking at maybe even, Mina's tricycle model, although we didn't mention that, but going away from opposites into a different maybe grouping to expand that. And also looking at type in terms of sacrosanct, that it is a model for development, and that it depends on the time of your life that you're in, how you perceive it and how you're looking at it. And then the point that I found most interesting about what's up for discussion is something that Paula mentioned about when we're picking fights that aren't fights. When we're being pushed into this, you have to debate it and you have to make a decision. Maybe we don't. Maybe it's okay to hold a yes and attitude and hold both, opposing things in mind.
Okay, thank you, Doris. I think that's all the groups. Is that right, Richard?
Unless anyone's been missed, it's the last chance to.
Last chance saloon.
No.
Okay, thank you. Let me put myself back over here where I can actually look at you properly. So thank you very much for that. That was really interesting for me, and I've taken notes of those. And I have to say, I do have a lot of sympathy for many of those ideas and things that could change. They're not necessarily the company line of a Myers-Briggs company, but I think there is definitely room for change, room for development, room for looking at things in a different way. Because I think if we're going to attempt to have those conversations with mainstream psychology, with academia, I think it's important that we know what those typical criticisms are and how we might respond to those, both emotionally and logically, but also just what our understanding of type is, where we might change our minds, where we might give ground, where there might be a space for discussion. I'm conscious I've gone just over my time, but I'm just going to be another 5 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. And I think it's important in this context to remember that none of us in academia or in the type community, none of us are dispassionate thinking machines. And this links a little bit to some of the things that Steve was talking about when he was talking about his research and his earlier presentations, I think. Because we all bring our existing knowledge, our existing biases, our existing values to the party. So we might think we deal with evidence in a very rational way. So new facts or evidence or information comes in. We look to see, is that credible, that information? We evaluate it. If it is, we accept it. If we don't, we reject it. Nice and straightforward. Of course, human beings ain't like that. When new facts or evidence information comes in, we evaluate it to see that it's credible, but I've drawn our box a little bit bigger than in the previous slide, because we start off by saying, consciously otherwise, does it fit with my worldview? Does it fit with my values? And if it does, then we ask ourselves, can I believe it? Is there any reason I shouldn't believe it? And if it's at all credible, we probably accept it. Whereas if it doesn't fit in with our worldview, doesn't fit in with our values, the question we actually ask ourselves is, must I accept it? Do I have to accept this? And unless I really have to accept it, I might decide to reject that information, very much in the way that Steve was talking about in some of his Brexit research. And I've actually got a quite similar slide to one of the ones that Steve did, because one of the things that psychological research has found is that the more knowledge you have, and to some extent, the more education you have, the worse that gets. So this is a research study carried out by Gallup back in 2015, in pre-Trump days even, and they asked people, is the seriousness of global warming generally exaggerated? Is it generally correct? Or is it generally underestimated? And they asked people with different levels of education. People who had only got as far as high school education, and if we compare Republicans and Democrats, and we look at the percentage of people who say, yes, the seriousness of global warming is generally exaggerated, that's the orange bar on the slide. 57% of Republicans, a little more than half, said it's exaggerated, but only a quarter of Democrats. Difference of 30%. Now, when they asked the same question to people who'd got as far as a college level education or higher, you might expect that with that greater level of education, they were more willing to listen to the facts and evaluate them dispassionately. But as you saw, I think, from some of Steve's results before, people ain't like that. There's actually a much bigger difference there between Republicans and Democrats. Having that extra education just gives people more tools, more knowledge, more certainty to actually confirm your existing picture and expectations. And I think this is important in the context of dealing with MBTI and type criticisms and dealing with academics, because for both us and academics, it's important to remember that people don't need to be convinced that type does or doesn't work. This, I think, links into a little bit what Doris was just saying before. They don't need to be convinced that the trait view of personality, the Big Five's approach is better. People who really want to cause problems just need to muddy the waters enough for people not to be sure, and then people don't move from their current position. This was the approach that the tobacco industry took back in the 1950s, and that climate change deniers are using today. And it was a favorite tactic, actually still is a favorite tactic, because he hasn't got away, of Donald J. Trump. Here's a quote from his former right-hand man, Steve Bannon. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. My apologies for the language. Now, some type critics have certainly flooded the zone with that stuff. And preparing this talk, I've come across quite a bit of it, including one article where a speaker at an academic conference was described and quoted as saying, literally, the MBTI is a load of, I'll say poo, I don't want to say the word again. And I'm sure there's times where we as a type community have flooded the zone with a certain amount of excrement ourselves as well, in an instinctive reaction to some of the things we've heard. But if both parties, us and mainstream psychologists, if we can sort of have a more honest conversation with each other and stop flinging material at each other, I apologize for any images I may be bringing up to mind there, on the basis of an informed knowledge of the criticisms that are out there, but I think there's going to be a lot less shit flying about, and I think that's a good thing. Even though it's going to give me less of an excuse to use the word shit. Oops, I said it again. In a presentation like this, which is not something you get to do every day. So I think I've just about run out of time. In fact, got a little bit over my time. But thank you very much for bearing with me during our session. I hope it was interesting. And I think we've got at least 10 minutes or so for any questions that you've got. So